Imagine you are standing in the city of Ugarit. The year is 1200 BC, and the greatest port city on the Mediterranean coast is burning. Not slowly, not quietly. Everything, all at once. The palace walls, which once gleamed white under the Syrian sun and echoed with the voices of merchants from Egypt, from Cyprus, from the Hittite heartland deep in Anatolia. Those walls now bear the scorch marks of a fire so intense that the very stones have cracked and split apart. The great warehouses, which just months ago overflowed with olive oil, copper ingots, ivory, and bolts of dyed linen worth more than a man's lifetime of labor, are collapsing inward, their cedar beams falling in cascades of orange ember. The harbor, which once welcomed hundreds of ships a season, is silent. And somewhere in the ruins of the Royal Archive, a clay tablet sits unfinished. The scribe never completed it. We don't know his name, we don't know if he survived the night, but we know what he was writing, because archaeologists pulled that tablet from the ash 3,000 years later, and the words on it are perhaps the most haunting in all of human history. The king of Ugarit was writing to the king of Cyprus, begging for ships, begging for grain, begging for soldiers. He described enemy ships appearing on the horizon. He described fire. He described a city that could not defend itself. The reply never came, because by the time anyone could have responded, Ugarit was already gone. And here is the thing that should keep you up at night. Ugarit was not alone. Within the span of roughly 50 years, centered on the year 1200 BC, every single major civilization in the Bronze Age Mediterranean world collapsed. Not declined, not weakened. Collapsed. The Mycenaean Greeks, whose palace culture had dominated the Aegean for centuries, vanished so completely that even their writing system was lost and forgotten. The Hittite Empire, which had once faced Egypt as an equal on the battlefield and carved peace treaties into silver tablets, ceased to exist almost overnight. Cyprus, Canaan, the Levantine coast, city after city after city, burned, abandoned, or simply emptied of its people. Historians call it the Bronze Age collapse, and after more than a century of archaeology, scholarship and debate, we still do not fully understand what caused it. But we are going to try to find out. To understand how something this enormous could fall, you first have to understand how extraordinary it was. The Late Bronze Age, roughly 1400 to 1200 BC, was one of the most sophisticated and interconnected periods in all of ancient history. This was not a world of isolated tribes fumbling in the dark. This was a world of diplomacy, of international trade networks, of letters written between kings who addressed each other as brothers, of luxury goods traveling thousands of miles from their point of origin to land in the treasure rooms of foreign palaces. Imagine you are a copper merchant operating out of Cyprus in 1300 BC. Your island sits at the center of a trade web that stretches from the tin mines of Afghanistan in the east to the amber forests of the Baltic in the north, to the gold fields of Nubia in the south. The copper your workshops produce will be alloyed with that Afghan tin to make bronze, and that bronze will become weapons and tools and decorative objects that end up in Egyptian tombs, in Mycenaean palaces, in Hittite temples. You do not think of yourself as living in a miraculous age. You simply think of it as the world. But it is, by any measure, astonishing. The great powers of this era communicated through a shared diplomatic language, Akkadian, written on clay tablets and carried by royal messengers across hundreds of miles of road and sea. We have recovered archives of these letters, the Amarna letters from Egypt, the Ugarit archives, the Hittite records from their capital at Hattusa, deep in the Anatolian plateau. And what they reveal is a world that feels, in certain ways, remarkably familiar. Kings complaining about late shipments, diplomats negotiating marriages between royal families, merchants filing complaints about unpaid debts across international borders. A world, in other words, where everything was connected to everything else. Which means that when things began to go wrong, they went wrong everywhere at once. But what went wrong? Here is where the story becomes complicated, and honestly, where it becomes truly fascinating. Because there is no single smoking arrow, no one invasion, no one earthquake, no one drought that historians can point to and say, there, that is the moment the Bronze Age ended. Instead, what the evidence suggests is something far more unsettling, something that a systems theorist in the 21st century would recognize immediately. It was a cascade failure. Let's talk about the Hittites, because if there is a ground zero for the Bronze Age collapse, it is Anatolia, modern Turkey. The Hittite Empire at its height was one of the dominant superpowers of the ancient world, a military and diplomatic force that had fought the Egyptians to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BC, and then negotiated what may be the world's earliest surviving peace treaty. Their capital, Hattusa, was a city of temples and lions carved in stone, of massive walls that stretched across the Anatolian highlands, of archives containing tens of thousands of clay tablets that recorded everything from religious rituals to military campaigns to trade agreements. Hattusa was destroyed around 1200 BC. The Hittite Empire vanished from history so completely that for 2,000 years, nobody even knew it had existed. It was only in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when archaeologists began excavating the ruins near the modern Turkish village of Boğazkale, that the Hittites re-emerged from the earth, their story written in cuneiform on thousands of recovered tablets. And what those tablets tell us about the final years of the empire is deeply unsettling. There are references to food shortages, to grain shipments desperately requested from Egypt, to military forces stretched thin across too many frontiers. The last Hittite king, Suppiluliuma II, was still conducting military campaigns in Cyprus, just years before everything ended. And then the tablets stop. For decades, historians pointed to one culprit above all others: the Sea Peoples. The Egyptians wrote about them extensively. Ramesses III recorded their assault on Egypt's borders around 1177 BC in temple inscriptions and reliefs at Medinet Habu, depicting a massive confederation of seafaring warriors arriving in waves of ships and land forces, cutting through the Levant and pushing toward Egypt itself. He claimed to have defeated them, but the cities and kingdoms in their path had not been so fortunate. The identity of the Sea Peoples remains one of the great mysteries of ancient history. Egyptian sources give us names: the Peliset, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh. Some scholars believe the Peliset may have become the biblical Philistines. Others see connections to Mycenaean Greeks, to Anatolian refugees, to displaced populations from the very civilizations that were already collapsing, which raises a deeply troubling possibility. What if the Sea Peoples were not the cause of the collapse, but a symptom of it? What if they were the desperate, displaced survivors of earlier collapses, driven by hunger and the loss of their homes, to become the destroyers of everyone else's? The predator and the prey, separated only by which city fell first. Modern science has added another layer to this story: paleoclimatological studies examining ancient pollen records, isotope data from cave formations, and sediment cores from the eastern Mediterranean seabed have revealed evidence of a prolonged and severe drought that struck the region beginning around 1200 BC. Crop failures, famine, the breakdown of agricultural systems that entire palace economies depended upon. This was not a single bad harvest. The evidence suggests a climate shift lasting decades, drying out the river systems and grain fields that fed the populations of every major Bronze Age state. And then there were the earthquakes. The eastern Mediterranean sits on one of the most seismically active regions on Earth, and archaeological evidence from multiple destroyed cities shows destruction layers consistent with powerful earthquakes occurring at precisely this period. Not enough on their own to end a civilization, but combined with drought, with famine, with displaced and desperate populations moving across the landscape, with trade networks already fracturing, and grain shipments already failing to arrive. Combined with all of that, perhaps enough to push an already weakened system past the point of no return. This is what historians now call a systems collapse. Not one cause, all of them, at once. Think about what that means for a moment, because this is where the Bronze Age collapse stops being ancient history and starts being something else entirely. We live in a world more interconnected than any that has ever existed. Our supply chains stretch across every continent. Our food systems depend on global shipping networks. Our economies are woven together in ways so complex that a crisis in one corner of the world sends ripples through every other corner within hours. We have built, in other words, a system of extraordinary sophistication and extraordinary fragility. The Bronze Age world looked at its own interconnectedness and saw strength. What it did not see, what it could not see, was that the very thing making it powerful was also making it vulnerable. Every broken link in the chain weakened every other link. The scholars and kings of 1200 BC did not know they were living through the end of their world. They were writing letters asking for grain shipments. They were filing diplomatic complaints. They were conducting military campaigns and planning for futures that would never arrive. And so we return, at the end, to Ugarit, to that unfinished clay tablet, to the scribe who set down his stylus in the middle of a sentence and never picked it up again. The message he was transcribing was a plea from a king who understood that something terrible was happening, but did not yet understand that it was already too late. He was asking his neighbors for help. He was operating, even in the final hours of his civilization, within the logic of a world that assumed cooperation, that assumed the networks would hold, that assumed someone would answer. No one answered. The ships did not come. The grain did not arrive. And Ugarit, like Mycenae, like Hattusa, like a dozen other cities whose names we are only now beginning to recover from the earth, simply ceased to be. The Bronze Age collapse did not announce itself. It did not arrive with a single conqueror, a single catastrophe, a single moment that everyone recognized as the end. It came slowly, and then all at once, in the way that all great collapses do. And for 300 years afterward, the Mediterranean world stumbled through a dark age. Populations plummeted, writing systems were forgotten, long-distance trade all but ceased, and the memory of what had existed before faded into legend and myth. It took 3 centuries to begin to rebuild what had been lost in 50 years. The last scribe of Ugarit never finished his tablet, but we found it. We read it. We are still asking the same questions he was asking on the night his world ended. Maybe that is enough. Maybe the fact that we are still here, still digging, still reading, still asking, is its own kind of answer. If you made it to the end of this video, you already know that history is not just a collection of dates and battles. It is a record of what human beings built, what they lost, and what they almost forgot entirely. This channel exists because those stories deserve to be told carefully, and because the people who lived them deserve to be remembered. If that matters to you, subscribe, because there are 1,000 more tablets still waiting to be read.